The Australian Labor Party's proposed bill, which is the party that is currently in governmental power in Australia at the moment, headed by Anthony Albanese, entitled Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, this is not only a massive threat to the freedom of speech of all Australians, it is a huge threat to all social media platforms if they comply. And the bill gives the Australian government leverage and legal kind of power to fine social media companies that do not comply to the arbitrary standards that it determines based on what they perceive as being harmful to the Australian people. If there is any misinformation put on any social media platform, doesn't matter if it comes from outside of Australia, from a person who isn't even Australian, if that content is accessible in Australia by Australians and is said or determined to pose a harm to the Australian people, this bill gives the Australian government power to enforce certain censorship standards and criteria on those social media platforms that they then expect to be applied on the platform generally, not just to users in Australia. Do you see how significant this actually is, and how much of a massive, unbelievable overreach in authoritarian censorship control by a corrupt government institution? Now, I have just spent hours reading through the Australian proposed bill, Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. That thing, right there. And to the best of my understanding, this is what it means, as I've described, and I'm going to be going into a bit more detail. Many Australians have been posting online about how much of a threat this bill is to Australian free speech, and they are absolutely right, but I haven't seen anyone actually latch on that the structure of this bill is intended to give the government insane leverage and influence to control the content of social media platforms globally. That would affect every user, not just Australians. And it does this by granting control and oversight over certain rules on the platform. And it is given to an Australian government agency called the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or ACMA. And the ACMA has the oversight and ability to arbitrarily determine what is misinformation, because this is one of the massive issues with the bill that many people have pointed out, but perhaps not latching on that this is made to apply to a social media platform and how it operates in multiple countries, essentially, to the best of my understanding. Okay? But it's the ACMA that will determine what is misinformation according to this bill. Okay, and it is very arbitrary with unspecific language in the bill that they determine this. And then, if that misinformation, as they see it, causes harm by some really not only loose and unspecific language, but there are some really concerning specificity in some parts as to what causes harm, which is a really ultra-progressive woke interpretation, which basically can mean anything that people might deem offensive for any number of reasons can be considered that is significant enough harm, okay, that poses a harm to the Australian people, that then gives the ACMA right to issue warnings and therefore then fines if they do not comply to the social media platforms. So the three kind of governing rules that this bill wants to give the ACMA ability to have power over the social media companies is first to basically demand social media companies to create a misinformation code that must then be applied. And I found it kind of odd that they would start with this, because if the social media companies don't comply, or if the ACMA just simply rejects and says it's not good enough, there's another provision that says, well, they can imply what is now considered the misinformation standards, which is determined by the ACMA and some other kind of relevant bodies that are associated with their platform specifically, right, to determine what would be the reasonable standards that they are then going to impose on the platform. And then there is another rule set that even supersedes that, called the Digital Platform Rules. And in the bill, it literally says the ACMA may, by legislative instrument, make rules, the digital platform rules, prescribing matters. And then it goes on to describe what those matters are. Required or permitted by this, so matters required or permitted by this act to be prescribed by the digital platform rules. And so anything in this bill, okay, that is required or permitted in the act as specified, such as what is misinformation and what is harmful and stuff like that, and how to police it or act in accordance, right? Okay, the ACMA simply has the ability to just make rules by legislative instruments according to their whim. That supersedes both the misinformation standards and then the misinformation code as codes that the ACMA basically demands the social media companies to produce. And so if it can already supersede these rules, specifically the misinformation code that the ACMA tells the social media companies to develop, why would they ask the companies to develop a social media code if they simply have power to overrule or overwrite it anyway? My conclusion that I come to would be because they expect that the misinformation codes that they demand the platforms to develop will be even more censorious than the standards that they could impose themselves through the misinformation standards or the digital platform rules that they get to make, which are required or permitted by the Act. So they first want to do it in such a way to get the platform to make a set of rules that they will approve, very likely being even more censorious. That's the conclusion that I come to. And then they will approve those social media, the misinformation codes, and then have an oversight over it to ensure that the social media companies enforce it. Enforce those codes. And if they do not enforce it, this act gives them ability to issue fines to the social media companies. As we see here under Section 52 of this bill, compliance with approved misinformation code. Once they develop a misinformation code, they expect it must be complied to. And under remedial directions, contravention of misinformation code, ACMA may give the provider a written direction requiring the provider to take specific action directed towards ensuring that the provider does not contravene the code or is unlikely to contravene the code in the future. A digital communications platform must not contravene a direction under subclause 2, and it says subclause 3, the one we just mentioned, that they cannot contravene the direction. So subclause 3 is a civil penalty provision. What does civil penalty provision mean? A civil penalty is a non-criminal remedy for a party's violation of laws or regulations. Civil penalties usually only include civil fines or other financial payments as a remedy for damages. So this is kind of almost sounding like an extortion racket at this point. That's you need to comply according to the standards that we are forcing you to make. And if you don't make them, we're just going to make up our own. And if you don't comply, you're going to have to pay up. And so an action seeking a civil penalty can be brought by the government or by private party in the shoes of the government. So if a platform does not enforce their misinformation codes on their user base, it can be fined as a remedy for damages, meaning if they do not ban or remove content that they have been forced to limit in a code approved by the ACMA, they will be fined. And that includes posts, information made by people in other countries outside of Australia that can merely be seen by Australians. Now, ultimately, do the social media platforms need to comply? Well, if they want to operate within Australia, it seems like, yeah, they would have to comply or face heavy fines that this legislation, to the best of my understanding, gives the government power to issue against them. And so I very likely see certain platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and perhaps even YouTube to comply. The only platform that I would see wouldn't comply, based on the track record, is X, Elon Musk, where in a truly admirable fight for free speech, he has opted to, versus government interference, remove the platform from being accessible in that country, which is really the result of the government doing it. But that would be the result, where if X will not comply, if this bill gets passed, okay, it would have to pay heavy fines, which I would only foresee must increase to even further or greater penalties, to fully being banned from the country by the act of the government doing it, or Elon Musk being forced to withdraw it out of Australia to avoid the legal disaster that would ensue and going through the courts. The bill also gives powers to have users be removed off social media platforms, as well as content being censored, not limited to Australians, only if the user in question or the content in question poses harm to Australians based on misinformation. And here is where it says it in the bill, but it actually says this multiple times, that there are multiple provisions that are justified according to this standard, which is the harm it may cause Australians by the content being on the platform, regardless of where it comes from. Okay, and so under the approval of codes provision, because the ACMA approves the misinformation codes that it is enforcing the platform to make, which it gets to arbitrarily choose which platforms needs a misinformation code, and it's the ones that are a problem. And so I have a feeling that they'll certainly impose this on X, but they might give the ones that are happy already to play ball or already very censorious and stuff like that free pass. They won't need any of this oversight. Well, the ACMA will approve a misinformation code if it satisfies, well, a number of things. But right here is where it talks about the harm to Australians. The ACMA is satisfied that the code is reasonably and appropriate and adapted to achieve the purpose of providing adequate protections for the Australian community from serious harm caused or contributed to by misinformation or disinformation on the platforms. Not on the platforms within Australia. There's no limitation there, just on the platforms flat. If there is content on the platform, even if it's in another country, that the ACMA determines is potentially or able, to cause serious harm to the Australian community due to misinformation, or more specifically, if the codes that the platforms make do not adequately censor their entire platform for the sake of not even most Australians. Most Australians hate this crap. It's the government deciding for the Australians. This is what you think. Albanese is constantly saying, all Australians agree that misinformation is a problem. From you, I might agree with that, but he's not going to censor himself, okay? He's using that as a means for more authoritarian control. You see, I'd like to think, and I know this is true for myself, that Australians, most of us, we're not delicate snowflakes that need daddy government to protect us from all the mean words online and the misinformation, things that can offend us or cause harm, or anything like that. I'm an adult. I can look after myself. Get out of my friggin' life, you pathetic, weaselly scumbag, right? But daddy government wants to come in and protect all Australians by policing now the entire globe. And he's doing that by wanting to police the whole platform, the entire platform, every single user that's on there, and any bit of content that appears on the platform that they perceive might cause harm to the Australian people, which is really cause harm to their power and influence, right? Their propaganda and bullcrap that they spread. That's the harm that they're worried about, right? And if it could cause that harm, they want power. The Australian Labor government wants power to censor that off that platform globally. And they're doing that by saying the rules and standards that you platforms need to create. You need to create a misinformation code. It needs to protect the Australian people. The Australian, Labor government needs to protect them. And if it's not good enough, we can impose restrictions, fines, remove the content, remove people off the platform, and fine the social media platforms, as I will show you. And so the bill gives powers, and it's worded very slimily because it's basically given by omission, by saying it won't do this in these circumstances, which is implying it has the power to do it in outside of those circumstances, to remove users and content. As it says here, removing content and blocking end users. Nothing in this part, digital platform rules made for the purpose of this part, an approved misinformation code, or a misinformation standard. And there are those 3 rules that can be imposed upon the social media platforms. It says, we list them right here. So digital platform rules, okay, which the ACMA can just determine for the purpose of this part, an approved misinformation code, which the ACMA can just make with a counseling body, or the misinformation code is made by the platform. The misinformation standard is made by the ACMA with a consultant, a digital communication platform to provider to remove from digital communications platform content disseminated using the platform where the dissemination is not disinformation on the platform that involves inauthentic behavior. So what that means is they will never remove from a digital communications platform content that's not disseminating misinformation. It'll only do it when it is misinformation. But how does it determine what is misinformation? It's an arbitrary standard determined by the ACMA, and I'll show them to you shortly, okay? And so this is not a protection. This is actually stating that, no, they will go out of their way to remove content that they deem as misinformation from the platforms completely. They're not limiting this to Australia, and also they would never prevent an end user from using. So they'll never prevent an end user from using a digital communications platform where the end user is not engaging in disinformation on the platform that involves inauthentic behavior. But if they are engaging in disinformation, yes, they would happily make sure that certain end users are barred from using certain digital communications platforms. That's what this is saying. What is misinformation according to this bill? Well, it defines it right here. For the purpose of this schedule, dissemination of content using a digital service is misinformation on the digital service if the content contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive. So who determines what is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive? It's the ACMA. It's whatever the government determines. And then they can just say, well, yeah, we reasonably believe that to be disinformation, and banhammer, remove the content. And so it's an arbitrary standard, okay? And we've seen examples time and time again of what the government thinks is authoritative information, what is true, especially with the pandemic recently, and the censorious nature that it tried to impose upon the Australian people. And we saw that also globally, okay? The government does not have the moral authority to determine what is actually true. Okay, they have proven time and time again that they are utterly incompetent and completely corrupted by their own political ends and goals, okay, for them to actually be a reliable source of what is correct or not. This is the Australian government trying to be the Ministry of Truth, not just for Australians, but the whole friggin' world. That's how bad this is, because according to this definition of misinformation, they can impose on social media companies globally to remove content or have users be barred from being on that platform. It's insane, but that's how far this bill goes. Okay? But also, if the content is provided on the digital service to one or more end users in Australia, and the provision of the content on the digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute serious harm. Okay, reasonably likely. Who determines what is reasonably likely to cause serious harm? And when you hear what is serious harm according to this bill, you will fall off your chair. It's that laughable. But then they also have, like, it's not misinformation if it's excluded, okay, or considered excluded dissemination. Excluded dissemination? What does that mean? Well, if you're an authoritative media source, okay, and you share what would be according to the government, verifiable misinformation, all right, if it was given by an individual, but if it's made by a source of media that it defines in the bill, that's excluded dissemination. It's not going to be put under any provision in this bill. It's insane. So here is the meaning of serious harm according to the bill. Harm to the operation or integrity of a Commonwealth, state, territory, or local government, electoral, or referendum process. Okay? Does that mean protests? Okay? That if you are promoting or organizing a protest or encouraging people to go, if that is considered, okay, to harm the operation or integrity of a Commonwealth, state, territory, or local government electoral or referendum process, okay, that is serious harm. And so that content can be removed, the user can be taken off the platform and also fined, and probably additional penalties, but also harm to public health in Australia, including to the efficacy of preventative health measures in Australia. You know what that's referring to, the efficacy of certain vaccines and other things like that. If you have questions about it and you're sharing it on social media and it's deemed to be harmful, okay, because it can harm the public health of Australia, because we all know how reliable the government is in determining what the best medical procedures and vaccinations are for the people, right? Well, they can just basically determine arbitrarily, according to their own governing body, that no, that causes harm, taken down. And remember, if this post causes harms to Australians, even if it's made outside of Australia by people who aren't Australians, this bill is made. Its entire architecture is constructed to give the government leverage and ability to censor content that is not just made by Australians, but people outside of Australia, and also content that can be seen outside of Australia, okay? If it's going to harm Australia in some way, and I'm not even sure banning it in Australia would essentially do that, because Australians can still get access to content, okay, even if Australia tries to block it, all right? And so if they determine that VPNs, okay, mean that blocking it in Australia isn't adequate, they can then, according to this bill, they have power to demand the content be censored globally. This one is laughable. So serious harm is, according to them, vilification of a group in Australian society distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, or national or ethnic origin, or vilification of an individual because of a belief that the individual is a member of such group. So this goes beyond just, if someone is in a minority status and they feel like they're being vilified, all you have to do is, unironically, as it says right here in the bill, belief that the individual is a member of such a group. If they are vilified because they are of the belief, even if they're not really of it, they just believe that they are a member of a certain race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, internet status, disability, nationality, or national ethnic origin, okay? And if they are vilified on that grounds, which means general criticism of people simply saying, no, you are not of that race, or you are not of that gender, I do not need to buy into your delusion, that can be considered vilification, and according to this bill, serious harm, and therefore censorship of that content. The content being removed, the person being removed off the platform, and or fined, and more. Do we see how insane this is? Okay? And once again, it doesn't just apply to Australians. Okay? This bill is one of the most vile, evil, authoritarian overreaches of power I've ever seen in Australia in my entire life. The government that has instituted this deserves to be brought up for human rights violations for just attempting to push this crap through. And this is why it's so important that every Australian, not just Australians, everybody who is seeing this spreads the message of how insane this bill is and how crazy and evil it is, and it needs to get pushback, okay? Because there is a chance that this can be voted down, but it requires a lot of voices speaking up against it. And that is only some of the conditions of serious harm, okay? Intentionally inflict physical injury to an individual in Australia or imminent damage to critical infrastructure or distributed. Now, I would assume that things like that, critical damage stuff, is already covered in laws, okay? Like anti-terrorism laws and stuff like that. And then imminent harm to Australian economy, including harm to public confidence in the banking system. If you if you harm public confidence in the banking system, that is serious harm and you will be censored, removed from platforms and or fine, okay? In the banking system or financial markets. This is insanity. Significant and far-reaching consequences for the Australian community or a segment of the Australian community, and severe consequences for an individual in Australia. So that is serious harm according to this bill. And a lot of it is going to be determined by so-and-so is offended. The government determines, no, that wasn't right. That is serious harm. So we then have the leverage and ability to censor, deplatform, and fine. But as apocalyptically vile as this bill is, it actually gets worse because the structure of this bill is specifically targeted for individuals, okay, to police them and not news organizations or even, it seems like, the government. Because under this section of the bill, meaning of excluded dissemination. Now, remember that previous part we were talking about that specifically here in the meaning of misinformation in this act, okay? For the purpose of this schedule, disinformation of content using a digital service is misinformation on the digital service if these conditions and if the dissemination is not excluded dissemination. So if it's under this exclusion, it is not considered misinformation according to this bill. And then it gives us what that definition is. Meaning of excluded dissemination. For the purpose of this schedule, the following are excluded dissemination. Dissemination of content that would reasonably be regarded as parody or satire. Good. Dissemination of professional news content. So if a professional news organization produces content which is literally saying the exact same type of what the government deems as misinformation that an individual might say on social media and get censored by this bill, if it's by a professional news organization under its, classification of professional news content, it is not then considered disinformation. And then it goes, also, it's not disinformation if it's reasonable dissemination of content for any academic, artistic, scientific, or religious purpose. That one also has means to be abused as well, because there was a lot of dissemination of, well, what we now know to be actual misinformation about the efficacy of certain vaccines, right? And that was disseminated for scientific purposes, you could say, or academic purposes as well, all right? And so this basically gives the government leeway, freedom, to disseminate what they want for any given purpose, right? For artistic, scientific, religious reasons, right? Wouldn't really do religious, the government, but scientific or academic. Oh, we're just doing that to spread, information correctly, okay? To give them allowance or an exemption under this Misinformation Act. Now, would it give an individual? What if you were trying to disseminate content for academic or scientific purposes? Well, guess what? You don't actually get to determine if it's really for these reasons. It's the arbitrary government body, okay? So you really think they're going to give you provision or allowances or exemptions accordingly? And then it goes on to explain this. For the purposes of this schedule, professional news content, okay, is news content produced by a person who, and it goes through if they're working for a newspaper, magazine, a television program, a radio program or channel, website, or part of a website. But there are also, they have to, like, that only counts if they are subject to the following, which is the rules of the Australian Press Council standards, the rules of Commercial Television Industry Code, the rules of Code of Practice mentioned in paragraph yada yada yada. And so basically all the governing rules for Australian mainstream media. And so if you're a smaller organization or even just a regular guy like me trying to share news, and I do have a registered company, okay, that I might come under program or channel, doesn't apply to me because I'm not big enough and probably not registered into certain bodies that would give certain protections. Okay, no, this bill is specifically targeted to affect individuals' free speeches. And shockingly, you'd think the government should be more concerned about protecting the individual from the misinformation of the mainstream media and their propaganda that they spew all the time. But this bill literally is the reverse of that, where it gives them a complete free pass to spit whatever bullcrap they spit, that they've been constantly doing it for years at this point, but to put under the boot the regular individual. And it's not just the regular Aussie. Again, the purpose of this is to affect everyone globally that is on the social media platforms that choose to bow down to this browbeating overreach of authority if they conform in making these misinformation codes or comply with these misinformation standards or platform rules as determined by the Australian governing body that gets to set those rules. And this part I found interesting because it goes out of its way, this bill goes out of its way to define separate to what professional news content is to news content. Okay, and the purpose of it doing this is to show that if there are individuals that are just giving news content, because for the purpose of this schedule, news content is content that reports, investigates, or explains any of the following. But the thing is, though, the excluded dissemination is not news content, it is specifically professional news content. Just news content is not excluded, okay? They specifically have made a distinction, okay, that will give people who are making professional news content an exemption and protection from this bill, but news content just listed by itself is not under this exemption. And it then goes out, so for someone like me or anyone online who is making just news content as defined by this is crazy, okay? This is just people talking about issues or events that are relevant in engaging persons in public debate or in informing democratic or decision making, okay? This could just be a Facebook post, and that is classed as news content, but not protected as professional news content. And that puts it under its target of being able to censor it. And so if you talk about current issues or events of public significance for persons at local, regional, national, or international level, even international, okay? And current issues or events of interests to persons, okay? And that's just making news content, and you're not given the exemption because it's not professional news content. This bill cannot get passed. If it does, its ramifications to that will affect not just Australians, but it can affect social media platforms globally if they choose to comply. Because remember, as I was explaining all throughout this video, the purpose of this bill is to enforce social media companies to govern and have misinformation codes and standards that they apply on their platform completely. Because any comment, any post, okay, that can be seen by Australians, even if it's made by people outside of Australia, right? If that is capable of causing harm, and we've seen what conditions it considers to be harm in this bill, well, that gives leverage to the ACMA to remove that content, remove users, and issue fines to the platforms if they do not comply. It is crazy, okay? And so what needs to happen is opposition to this. You need a right to your local representatives, even if you're outside of Australia, rights to representatives inside Australia, wherever you can find access. Heck, even your Australian diplomat, if you needs be, to express your deep concerns about what is going on here. This bill is evil and insane, and it is a sign of complete authoritarian intent. This is an act by a government that wants to control the narrative, wants to control truth, doesn't like to be called out on its bullcrap, because, anything that proves that they're wrong, well, no. They're the ones who are spreading misinformation. That's the result. Anthony Albanese is one of the most idiotic, tone-deaf politicians we've ever seen, where he can't even handle memes being made of him.
Media platforms have a responsibility to make sure that misinformation isn't got out there. I noticed today, for example, they've removed various sites that were up containing fake images of myself superimposed on other people. That's the sort of thing that is going on social media.
I don't think so. No. I don't think so. No. It's never, ever gonna happen. I don't think so. No. I don't think so. No. It's never, ever gonna happen.
And literally, if you think this won't try and police memes that people find offensive, like memes of Anthony Albanese, he wants to police that. He can't stand it. He's got the thinnest skin ever, okay? This is an act of authoritarianism, okay, by a thin-skinned, overreaching, corrupt government that needs to be opposed wholly and completely. And all I can do is encourage you to spread the word. Share this video, share it on social media, and share that this bill is a threat to not just Australian free speech, but the free speech of the internet. It is unironically that bad.